Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. I'd like to address abuse of power on the part of gurus and other spiritual teachers, why that happens and what to look out for. Time and time again, you hear of gurus and other spiritual teachers becoming ego-inflated and abusing their power. What happened to them, and why does this happen? First of all, it's important to understand that most who become gurus or spiritual teachers are not fully enlightened, meaning they're not in their last lifetime, or it's unlikely they'd take on a position of power in relation to spiritual seekers. Fully enlightened individuals are often uninterested in teaching or being involved with the public in any way that would elevate themselves. That said, some enlightened masters do work quietly and simply with a relatively few followers, and a spiritual teacher doesn't have to be fully enlightened to be helpful to students. Unenlightened teachers who are sincere in wanting to serve in this way and who have cleared their personal issues sufficiently won't elevate themselves or allow themselves to be elevated to the role of guru or any other position that grants them special power over others. Those who seek power or enjoy power and abuse power are obviously not done with their human lessons. The lessons around being a spiritual teacher are important lessons in the soul's evolution. These lessons are many and take many lifetimes to complete for most individuals. So please don't assume that gurus or spiritual teachers are enlightened and in their last lifetime. It would be much safer to assume that, since they're taking on such a role, they are not enlightened, meaning in their last lifetime. This is not to disparage spiritual teachers in general, for spiritual teachers and teachings are necessary and important. But you should be aware that teachings being dispensed by many gurus go beyond spiritual truths. Many are teaching seekers inadvertently, through their own misguided means, not to give their power over to others. By abusing their power, some gurus and some spiritual teachers are teaching those who might fall prey to giving their power away not to do so. Although these gurus or teachers are not conscious of teaching this important lesson, this is often part of the guru-disciple curriculum. This doesn't make it right that these gurus or teachers are abusing their power. Just because spiritual seekers learn an important lesson, one they didn't set out to learn, doesn't make the guru any less responsible for the harm they cause. Those who abuse their power will not only need to learn not to do so, but they'll have to make amends in this lifetime or in others to balance the harm they caused. This is no small transgression. When you're in a position of power, which you placed yourself in, no matter how it may seem, you have a sacred duty to use that power carefully and wisely. To not do so is to incur karma, for naturally people will look to you for guidance. Being a skillful guide means guiding people to discover for themselves what is true for them and to take responsibility for their choices, not make choices for them. This is where many in positions of power go wrong. They give specific guidance to those looking for it, and those looking for someone to make choices for them gladly follow this guidance, or not so gladly, and yet still follow it. One of the basic human lessons is learning to make your own choices and accept and learn from the consequences of them. When you abdicate your free will and allow another to choose for you, that will never be the right choice for you, because you've abdicated your will in so doing. The guru-disciple relationship is fraught with this tendency to give one's power over to another, and both teacher and student are learning critical lessons around this. Those who want another to choose for them find someone who will do so, and those who want to have others in their control will find those looking for a leader who will take control. Both are learning important lessons, and these lessons aren't learned without pain, mostly on the part of those who give their power away. The one who takes people's power, however, will have to meet with circumstances, if not in this lifetime, then in another, to balance such an experience. These individuals may find themselves in positions where others have power over them, and they have little control over their own lives. This is painful indeed, but sometimes the only way this lesson is learned. But why does this even happen? How is it possible that spiritually advanced people who have spiritual powers, could abuse that power? To understand this, you must understand that there's a difference between spiritual advancement, advancing toward enlightenment, and spiritual powers, or siddhis or other psychic powers. It's very possible, indeed quite common, for people to have siddhis and psychic powers and not be spiritually advanced. To be spiritually advanced requires a certain level of embodiment of love, compassion, and acceptance. Think of the Dalai Lama. He is an example of someone who's embodied. He embodies the qualities of enlightenment, love, peace, compassion, acceptance, and wisdom. These qualities are the measure of a person's spiritual advancement, not siddhis or psychic abilities, which can develop in people who still have a potential for corruption of their character due to unresolved psychological issues. Those who've resolved their psychological issues, at least for the most part, will naturally express love, peace, compassion, acceptance, and wisdom. They'll express wisdom because they'll be channels for intuitive wisdom and guidance, since they're no longer listening to the voice in their head, the ego. And, I should add, they'll express these qualities consistently and regardless of their circumstances. In other words, those who've resolved their psychological issues sufficiently express love, peace, compassion, and kindness as their default, and rarely express anger, hostility, unkindness, blame, or other negative emotions. And if they do, these expressions are brief and immediately or later recognized, owned, and made apologies for. No one is perfect, but those who are far along on the path will admit their imperfections and apologize and make amends for them. They have a self-awareness and ability to see and admit to their failings that others who haven't done their psychological work don't have. That's one of the biggest differences between those who are embodied and those who are still able to be corrupted by the ego. Those who are embodied recognize this corruption when it arises, while those who are not embodied blame others or circumstances or make excuses for their bad behavior. Anyone who isn't feeling and expressing love, peace, and compassion most of the time still has a long way to go in their spiritual development, regardless of how many spiritual experiences they've had or how psychic they are. These things are not markers of spiritual advancement, but phenomena along the way, which say nothing about where someone is at on their spiritual journey. It's mistaken to assume that those who've had many spiritual experiences, including experiences of oneness, are enlightened. These individuals may very well have something to offer spiritual seekers, and for them teaching may be perfectly appropriate. But when spiritual seekers assume that a teacher is fully enlightened, or when the teacher assumes this and claims this is dangerous. No one can really know if someone is enlightened, that is, in their last lifetime. How could someone know that for certain? It's always best to assume that a teacher has a ways to go and is fallible. Any claim to infallibility is a red flag. No human being is infallible. Only the ego would assume infallibility, and the ego is sneaky this way. The ego can always reconstellate, even within the most advanced seeker or teacher. Would someone who has deeply realized oneness elevate himself or herself above others, or put themselves in a position of power over others? This makes no sense. Humility is an underrated virtue, but it is the marker of someone who's realized his or her true nature fully. Enlightenment results in humility, not specialness, infallibility, and special powers. Special powers make someone who hasn't completed the spiritual journey feel very special, and this is one of the greatest dangers of psychic gifts or other spiritual powers. How can the ego not feel special when you can do or know things that others can't know? This gives those who have these gifts an inflated sense of self and an inflated sense of power that is inebriating. Very few with such gifts do not fall prey to such intoxication, and many with such powers live lifetime after lifetime before they learn to handle such gifts without becoming intoxicated with the power these gifts give them. There are reasons spiritual traditions have warned of such powers. Lifetimes of lessons with these powers eventually lead to having a right relationship to them. But chances are that a guru or teacher who displays such powers or wields power as a result of having such gifts has not learned those lessons yet. Beware of those with special gifts and watch carefully how they use them. That will tell you a lot about their spiritual maturity and whether they can be a worthy teacher for you. Psychic and other spiritual gifts are the result of the Kundalini opening certain centers in the brain. This is not the same thing as enlightenment, and in fact is common in those whose Kundalini has risen, not up the central channel, but through other channels or nadis. When the Kundalini rises through these other channels, it opens brain centers, but it cannot culminate in enlightenment. Instead, it travels downward again, stirring the lower chakras and any remaining psychological residue. This state of affairs is confusing to both the guru and his or her students. It may take lifetimes before the Kundalini is able to shift into the central channel and rise as it's meant to. This is a problem for spiritual teachers and seekers alike, and it's important that both be aware of this. So much abuse of power happens because of this irregular movement of Kundalini, and so little is known of this phenomenon and how to correct it. This is why so many gurus and spiritual teachers with impressive powers abuse these powers. Kundalini activates these powers and causes those who put themselves in a position of guru or spiritual teacher to fall from grace, because they don't have the spiritual development to handle these powers. That's what's happening with many gurus and spiritual teachers, and seekers are often the ones who pay the price for ignorance of this phenomenon. Another problem for those who have psychic powers who have unresolved psychological issues is that these issues render their psychic abilities unreliable and even dangerous. If you have the gift of channeling, for instance, you may have access to wise information at times, but not consistently. And if you believe that the information that comes through you is infallible, you'll be misled and you'll mislead others. Unresolved psychological issues and ego identification can make a channel vulnerable to negative non-physical forces who inflate the channel's ego even further and deliver incorrect and destructive information. If gurus or teachers believe they're infallible, that's a sign of ego, and that belief and attachment to ego make it easy for those individuals to be manipulated by negative forces. So then their so-called psychic gifts operate no longer as gifts, but as a means by which they're toyed with by negative forces on other dimensions. This is a common occurrence with gurus and spiritual teachers who have psychic gifts and who are invested in power. Psychic gifts and ego, which produces a drive for power, is a dangerous combination. So please be careful about who you believe and what you believe, no matter how elevated someone might seem. Thank you for your attention to this message. I am with you always.